You're not even her real granddaughter. My father spat, fury warping his features as we stood in Grandmother Margot's study, the towering shelves and solemn leather-bound volumes bearing witness to the moment my world cracked open. Just 3 days had passed since we laid her to rest, and already the Blackwell legacy had become a battlefield. My heart thundered as I stared at him. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, barely able to summon the words. He sneered. "Don't act surprised, Clara. Your mother's secret isn't so secret anymore. Margot worshipped bloodlines. Once the lawyer confirms you're not a real Blackwell, you'll get nothing." I stared at the man I had called my father for 27 years, barely holding my voice steady. "So you're saying only blood relatives deserve her fortune? That's your final word?" "Absolutely," he said, with the same smug tilt of the chin that had loomed over my childhood. Always withholding affection, always judging. "I'll make sure the family legacy stays with real Blackwells, not imposters." Until 5 minutes ago, I thought I was a Blackwell. Now, in the heart of my grandmother's Georgian estate outside Philadelphia, I was discovering otherwise. I wasn't after money. I wanted the fairness my grandmother intended. She had spoken to me directly, just weeks before she died, making it clear that I was to be part of her estate. But Victor, the man whose approval I had sought for decades, had other plans. "You can attend the will reading if you must," he said coldly, already dismissing me like a stranger. "But don't expect anything. Edgar and I are ready to contest any part that names you." The chill deepened. Edgar Mills, our family attorney and my father's lifelong friend, was in on it. "I'll be there," I replied evenly. "Grandmother wanted me there." He scoffed. "Sentiment. Margot always had a soft spot for you, but the law doesn't care about feelings." He swept from the room, leaving behind the scent of cologne and cruelty. I sank into Grandmother's chair, tracing the walnut grain of the desk where she had built her empire, penned letters in her sharp script, and finalized the will they now aimed to bury. My phone buzzed, a message from my mother. "We need to talk about your father. Tonight. Alone." A chill crept down my spine. If Victor wasn't my biological father, who was? And why had the truth remained buried all these years, only to rise now, days before the inheritance would be divided? One thing was certain. The man I once called Dad had always viewed me with disdain, but now I saw the full depth of his resentment. Being a Blackwell meant inheriting more than wealth. It meant bearing the weight of legacy, pride, and cold-blooded ambition. Victor, as the eldest son, was the crown prince of that empire, raised to protect and preserve it. But me? I had been nothing more than a threat, and yet, as I sat in the heart of Margot's domain, her scent still lingering in the air, I realized something else. If blood was the only currency my father valued, then he had no idea just how rich I truly was. Graham Blackwell had always been the family outlier. Brilliant, irreverent, unbound by their grandfather's strict expectations. He'd traded Philadelphia's legacy for medical research in Seattle, appearing only at milestones, his warm presence a breath of fresh air amid the tension that seemed to tighten every room my father, Victor, entered. I remembered Graham's laughter, his thoughtful gifts, the way he asked questions that made me feel seen, unlike Victor, who measured worth in conquest and conformity. My brothers, Ryan and Luke, had thrived under his cold ambition. One followed him into the family empire, the other dazzled in law school. But I, with my honors degree in historical preservation and a career steeped in culture and meaning, had never been enough. "She lacks the Blackwell drive," he'd say within earshot, his voice thick with disappointment. I used to think it was sexism, or his impossible standards, but the truth, as it unraveled, ran far deeper. My grandmother Margot had been my refuge, her love unconditional, her belief in me unwavering. Where Victor saw failure, she saw fire. She encouraged my passions, hosted me for weekly tea, and filled those afternoons with stories of bold women, whispered rebellions, and a family history far more tangled than I realized. A true Blackwell makes her own path, she'd remind me, her eyes bright with mischief. Losing her had felt like the ground giving way beneath my feet, but I clung to her memory, and her cryptic final words haunted me now more than ever. Trust your instincts, Clara. Not everything is as it appears. In the days after her funeral, I noticed the shift. Victor's watchful gaze, the whispered meetings with Edgar Mills, the silences that stretched like taut wire. I thought it was grief. I was wrong. That afternoon in grandmother's study, when Victor spat the words, "You're not even her real granddaughter," the floor fell out from under me again. He spoke of bloodlines like they were currency, dismissing me as counterfeit, denying me the legacy Margot had promised. And when I asked him through clenched teeth if blood was his sole measure of worth, he nodded proudly, unaware that he'd just gifted me the leverage I never knew I had. The truth burned brighter with every second. I left the mansion and met my mother at her favorite hidden cafe, where Blackwell nameplates carried no weight. She looked hollowed out, worn down by secrets she never meant to share this way. "Victor shouldn't have told you like that," she said, voice raw. "Yes," I whispered. "So it's true." Her nod was slow, heavy. "It's more complicated than he'll ever admit." And then, over steaming coffee and shaking hands, she told me a story that shattered the last of my illusions. Before she ever met Victor, she had loved Graham, my uncle, the family rebel, the only man who ever made her feel free. They had once been young, wildly in love, planning a future together until ambition pulled Graham westward with a prestigious research fellowship in Seattle. "We agreed he should go," my mother said, her voice brittle with old memories. "It was too good to pass up." But distance proved a cruel test, and while she waited for letters and promises, it was Victor, steady, waiting in the wings, who offered comfort in a moment of vulnerability. Their brief entanglement ended when she realized her heart still belonged to Graham, but by then, everything had changed. "When I found out I was pregnant," she whispered, "I knew it was Graham's." The timing was exact. He had just been home. Her hands trembled on her coffee cup, but Victor, calculating even then, claimed the child was his. Graham, newly engaged to another woman, was gone, unreachable. Victor proposed quickly, insisting marriage was the honorable solution. "Only later did I understand," she said bitterly. "It was never about love. He needed a wife and child to secure his standing. The Blackwell inheritance favors men with legitimate heirs. I needed stability. He needed leverage." The truth landed like a thunderclap. Every memory I held twisted into a new shape. Victor's constant criticism, Graham's quiet affection during his rare visits, and grandmother Margot's unwavering devotion to me. "Did Graham ever know?" I asked. "No," she replied, barely above a whisper. It seemed too cruel to disrupt his life again. The weight of her silence stretched across the table, and now, decades later, Victor had chosen this moment, mere days after Margot's funeral, to finally spit out the truth like venom. "He's terrified," my mother said. "He thinks Margot left you a large share of the inheritance. He's trying to discredit you." "But if I'm not a Blackwell by blood—" "You are," she interrupted, fire returning to her voice. "You're Graham's daughter. That makes you Margot's granddaughter by blood. Victor's plan could backfire spectacularly." The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Victor's desperate attempt to cut me out might be the very thing that cements my place in the family legacy. "What do I do now?" I asked. My mother reached for my hand, her grip fierce. "That depends, Clara. Do you want revenge, recognition, or simply what's rightfully yours?" I didn't know yet, but I knew I wouldn't let Victor twist the truth to serve himself. I would not let him write me out of history. The only question was how to prove it. The next morning, nerves tangled in my chest, I drove to Graham's apartment. I'd called ahead, vague but urgent. Family matters, before the will reading. Now I sat in his living room, surrounded by shelves of medical journals and artifacts from far-flung research expeditions. Graham moved with the grace of someone who carried knowledge like armor. "You seem troubled, Clara," he said, offering tea, his eyes kind and curious. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, saw echoes of myself in the curve of his mouth, the shape of his jaw. My throat tightened. Everything was about to change, for him and for me. At 58, Graham Blackwell still possessed the effortless elegance and sharp gaze that had once made him the family's golden son, those same dark eyes that stared back at me every morning in the mirror. When I arrived, unsure of how to breach the storm brewing beneath my skin, he greeted me with warmth that quickly turned to concern. "Is Victor making things difficult about Margot's estate?" he asked. "It's more complicated than that," I began, hesitating as the words caught in my throat. "How does one ask a man if he might be your father?" "Uncle Graham, did you and my mother were you together before she married Victor?" His teacup stopped mid-air, his expression shifting from surprise to careful stillness. "Why ask about ancient history now?" I met his eyes. "Because Victor just told me I'm not his biological daughter, and he's using that to try and cut me out of grandmother's will." Graham set his cup down slowly, the weight of my words sinking in. "That sounds like Victor. Cruelty disguised as strategy." He stared at me with renewed intensity. "What did Elise tell you?" I repeated what my mother had confessed. Their young love, the separation, the brief romance with Victor that followed, the pregnancy she believed was Graham's. His features cycled through disbelief, sorrow, and finally, something that resembled fragile hope. "I never knew," he whispered. "She didn't tell me she was pregnant. When I learned she'd married Victor, I thought it was over." Then softly, "Are you saying I might be your father?" I nodded. "The timing fits. And Victor's planning to challenge grandmother's will, claiming I'm not a true Blackwell." Graham's jaw clenched. "Margot named you in her will. That much I know. Victor can't erase her wishes with a DNA smear campaign. But if proof is what he wants..." He stood abruptly and paced the room, his long strides matching the agitation in his voice. "Even if you're not Victor's daughter, if you're mine, then you're still Margot's granddaughter by blood." He turned, meeting my gaze with resolve. "We'll get a DNA test. If I'm your father, we'll prove it." The calm logic of his proposal steadied the storm inside me. "You'd really do that?" I asked. "Without hesitation," he replied. "I've always felt something, a connection to you that didn't make sense. If you are mine..." He paused, his voice thick. "Let's find out." We arranged expedited testing that afternoon, using a discreet private lab with a promise of results in 72 hours, just in time before the will reading. As the samples were sealed and sent away, anticipation twined with fear in my chest. Whatever the outcome, nothing would ever be the same. While waiting, I reached out to grandmother's private attorney, Bernard Walsh, an intentional move to bypass Edgar Mills, Victor's longtime ally. Bernard received me in a quiet office lined with aged law books and the scent of old leather. "I can't share specifics before the official reading," he said, voice careful. "But your grandmother was deliberate and mentally sound when she finalized her will. Her wishes were clear." I leaned forward. "Did she know about my parentage?" Bernard hesitated just long enough to betray the truth. "Margot Blackwell saw more than people gave her credit for. Very little escaped her." It wasn't a confirmation, but it didn't need to be. She had known. She had planned. I left his office with renewed conviction, only for it to shatter that evening when a formal letter arrived. Edgar Mills had petitioned the court to delay the will reading, citing unresolved concerns about the identity of a named beneficiary. Me. The timing was no coincidence. Victor was making his move. But what he didn't realize was that mine was already in motion. Victor was moving faster than I expected, wielding his legal influence to stall the will reading while he scrambled to dismantle my claim. When I called Bernard to ask about the sudden delay, his secretary informed me, curtly, that he'd been hospitalized with pneumonia and would be unavailable for the foreseeable future. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Victor wasn't just building a case. He was methodically cutting me off from every ally I had left. Without Bernard's guidance and without the DNA results, I'd be walking into the reading blind. That night, my mother called in a whisper, panic laced through her voice. "Victor knows you met with Graham. He's furious. Clara, be careful. When he feels threatened, he becomes dangerous." I barely slept. But 2 days before the rescheduled reading, the DNA results landed in my inbox. Encrypted, clinical, cold. With trembling fingers, I scrolled past paragraphs of scientific jargon until the conclusion leapt from the page. Probability of paternity, 99.99998%. Graham Blackwell was, without question, my biological father. I sat back, my pulse roaring in my ears as a lifetime of confusion snapped into focus. Vindication, grief, fury. They surged together. Victor, the man whose approval I'd begged for, who had treated me like an outsider in my own family, had never been my father at all. I called Graham. He answered immediately, and when I told him, his voice cracked. "I suspected, Clara. You have Elise's smile, but those eyes, they're your grandmother's." We agreed to meet before the reading, finally ready to stand as allies, not strangers. I thought I had the upper hand now. I was wrong. That evening, I received an urgent request from Edgar Mills for a private meeting at his office. My instincts screamed no, but curiosity overrode caution. If Victor's longtime attorney wanted to speak before the reading, it meant something had shifted. The law firm of Mills and Associates reeked of old money and inherited power. Edgar greeted me with his signature polished smile, but his eyes were steel. "Clara, thank you for coming. There are certain matters I believe we should discuss before the will is made public." I folded my arms. "You mean Victor's lie about my parentage, or your baseless petition to delay the reading?" His smile thinned. "Actually, I'm referring to the DNA test you arranged with Graham." My blood turned to ice. We'd been discreet. How could he know? "Victor is quite distressed by your independent verification," Edgar continued smoothly, sliding a folder across the desk. I opened it. A formal waiver, offering $250,000 in exchange for relinquishing any claim to Margot Blackwell's estate. I blinked. "This is a joke," I said, pushing it back. "My grandmother named me in her will." "Yes," Edgar replied calmly, "under the assumption you were Victor's daughter. Now that this assumption has been proven false, now that I'm proven to be Graham's daughter," I snapped, "which makes me Margot's biological granddaughter." Victor's words were clear. Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. A flicker of discomfort crossed Edgar's face. There are complexities you don't understand, Clara. Legal structures within the Blackwell Trust. Clauses that supersede simple bloodlines. What complexities? I demanded. I can't disclose those before the official reading, he said, voice lowering into something near a threat. But I advise you to consider this offer. Victor is prepared to defend the family's interests with everything he has. I left the office with my jaw tight and my resolve ironclad. Let them come. I had the truth now, or so I believed, until the next morning shattered everything I thought I understood. Graham's voice crackled through the line, tight with barely restrained fury as he dropped a revelation that flipped my entire world on its head. Victor, the man who had weaponized bloodline purity to disinherit me, wasn't biologically a Blackwell at all. A retired nurse who'd once worked with Graham and Victor's parents had confided the truth. Victor had been secretly adopted after their mother suffered multiple miscarriages. Years later, Graham was born unexpectedly, and the family kept the adoption hidden to avoid making Victor feel like an outsider. The irony hit with brutal clarity. By the very standard Victor had tried to wield against me, he was the one without a legitimate claim. Does Victor know? I asked, barely able to breathe. Graham didn't think so, but suspected Margot had always known the truth. She and their mother had been incredibly close. That explained Edgar's arrogance. Somewhere in the estate documents, the trust must define inheritance by bloodline. Graham had reviewed them himself and confirmed it. A clause requiring direct biological descent for principal heirs. Victor had thought his legal status protected him, but in accusing me of not being a real Blackwell, he might have just disqualified himself. What do we do with this? I asked. Graham's answer was measured but resolute. It depends what you want, Clara. There's what Victor deserves, and then there's what's right. I didn't hesitate. Let him live by the rules he set. The day of the will reading arrived crisp and cold, the fall colors of Philadelphia blazing outside Margot's estate. Graham and I arrived early, our newfound alliance quiet but unshakable. Inside, Edgar Mills sat poised at the head of the grand dining table, Blackwell relatives arranged like chess pieces around him. Victor sat across from me, flanked by my brothers, his posture smug and confident, convinced he was about to cement his legacy by erasing mine. Edgar cleared his throat. Before we begin, I must address a delicate matter regarding succession eligibility. Victor straightened, offering me a smirk. It has come to our attention that certain beneficiaries named in Margot Blackwell's will may not qualify under the bloodline provisions of the family trust. Edgar continued, his voice polished. I felt my mother squeeze my hand beneath the table. Edgar explained that the estate was divided, half under Margot's control, the other half governed by the old trust created by her father, with strict rules requiring heirs to be blood descendants. Victor pounced, standing smoothly. We have evidence that Clara is not my biological daughter, he announced, sliding a folder toward Edgar. Under the trust terms, she is ineligible. Gasps rippled through the room. My heart hammered in my chest. This was our moment. Graham rose slowly, voice calm but commanding. If we're evaluating heirs based on bloodline, then we must consider all such evidence, not just what Victor provides. Edgar blinked as Graham laid a second folder on the table. This, Graham said, contains DNA test results confirming that Clara is my biological daughter, which makes her Margot's granddaughter by blood. Victor paled, his composure cracking for the first time. That's absurd. Is it? Graham cut him off, his tone sharp. Because I also learned something recently. Victor is adopted. Not by fault of his own, but by design. Our parents chose to keep it private. But if we're using biology as a sword, Then let's swing it both ways. Edgar hesitated, flipping through the documents. The silence was thunderous. Then he looked up. These results change everything. Victor's expression collapsed into disbelief as Edgar explained that, by the trust's own wording, Clara had a stronger claim than Victor. The man who had tried to cut me out using lineage had just excommunicated himself. And as he sat frozen, surrounded by shocked relatives and a legacy slipping through his fingers, I leaned back, finally calm. Revenge wasn't loud. It was quiet, sharp, and just. We had intended to introduce the paternity revelation ourselves, but Victor beat us to it, presenting DNA test results I never consented to, collected without my knowledge. "May I ask how you obtained my DNA?" I asked, keeping my voice calm though my pulse thundered in my ears. Victor offered a cold smirk. "Your water glass, at our last family dinner. Quite simple, really." Graham stiffened beside me. "That's illegal. Unauthorized genetic testing." But Edgar, ever Victor's shield, dismissed it. The science stands, regardless of collection method. Our carefully orchestrated plan began to fracture, the balance tipping. If Edgar legitimized Victor's unethical evidence and refused ours, we'd lose control of the narrative. I straightened and withdrew our own test results from my bag. "I have additional evidence," I said clearly. "This test confirms that Graham Blackwell is my biological father." A wave of gasps rippled across the room. Victor turned to my mother, his face a mask of betrayal, but she met his glare without flinching. Edgar reviewed the documents, then shook his head. "It changes nothing. The trust specifies Blackwell blood from Margot's direct line, Victor's line, to his legitimate heirs." That was our opening. Graham rose, calm and commanding. "I believe we should review the actual language of the trust. My understanding is that it requires heirs to be blood descendants of Harold Blackwell, Margot's father, not necessarily through Victor." Edgar narrowed his eyes. "And what's the issue?" Graham didn't hesitate. "Victor isn't biologically a Blackwell. He was adopted as an infant. Our parents kept it quiet, but Margot knew, and I have both adoption records and DNA confirmation." The room fell into stunned silence. Victor's face went pale, his hands clenching at his sides. "Lies," he hissed, but his voice cracked. Graham remained steady. "If Victor insists that only biological Blackwells are entitled to inherit, then by his own standard he has no claim. I, as Margot's only biological child, and Clara, as my daughter, are the rightful heirs." Edgar visibly faltered, torn between loyalty and law as Graham laid the final documents on the table. Victor shot to his feet. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "I won't stand for this slander." I looked him in the eye. "You're the one who insisted only bloodline matters. Are you changing your stance now?" Before Victor could explode again, the heavy library doors creaked open, and every head turned. Bernard Walsh, Grandmother Margot's trusted attorney, thought to be bedridden, entered, leaning on a cane but radiating resolve. "Apologies for my delay," he said, locking eyes with Edgar, whose face blanched. "I believe my presence is required for this reading." Bernard's appearance confirmed what we'd feared. Victor and Edgar had tried to sideline him for their own agenda. "I'd like to review the documents," Bernard said calmly, lowering himself into a chair. His sharp eyes scanned the adoption papers, the DNA results, the trust clauses, taking in the brewing storm with practiced precision. Victor looked truly afraid for the first time. His scheme was unraveling, and as Bernard turned to the final pages of Margot's will and adjusted his glasses, his voice rang with the clarity of justice long overdue. before proceeding with the individual bequests. Bernard's voice cut through the charged silence as he lifted a sealed envelope embossed with the Blackwell crest. Margot's final directive, to be read only if matters of lineage were disputed. The room held its breath as he unfolded the thick, cream-colored letter and began to read aloud. To my family gathered here. If this letter is being read, then the secret I have carried for decades has come to light. I have always known Victor was not born of Blackwell blood, but was lovingly adopted by my husband and me after our years of heartbreak. And I have also known, from the moment I first held her, that Clara is Graham's biological daughter. A grandmother knows her own blood. Gasps rippled through the room. Margot's voice, immortalized on the page, cut through years of deceit. The Blackwell Trust, established by my father, mandates that only blood descendants may inherit its assets. Anticipating future contention, I took steps to separate my personal wealth, what many of you call the Blackwell fortune, from the trust, ensuring my wishes would be carried out unchallenged. To Victor, you have been my son in the ways that count, but your cruelty toward Clara, your brother's child, reveals a character unworthy of the legacy you so obsessively covet. By your own insistence on bloodline purity, you have undone yourself. Bernard paused, leveling a pointed look at Victor, whose complexion had turned ashen. Then, with quiet finality, he continued. According to Margot's instructions and the DNA evidence confirming both Victor's adoption and Clara's parentage, the trust assets shall pass in full to Graham Blackwell and his biological daughter, Clara. As the words sank in, Victor lurched toward the table, grasping for the documents. Bernard shifted them away with a composed hand. You promised! Victor shouted, voice cracking under the weight of his unraveling control. You said only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. I met his eyes, my voice calm and steady. Number, you said that. I only asked if you'd keep your word, and you promised you would. The true satisfaction wasn't in the inheritance. It was in watching his carefully woven web of manipulation collapse under the weight of his own hypocrisy. The fallout played out like the closing scene of a tragedy. Victor, undone and humiliated, stormed from the mansion with a flurry of empty legal threats. Edgar Mills followed, his professional reputation in ruins after Bernard quietly revealed that Edgar had long known about Victor's adoption but helped suppress the truth. My brothers, pale and shaken, lingered behind. Ryan, the gentler of the two, was the first to approach. I didn't know, he said softly. But looking back, the way he treated you, I get it now. Luke nodded beside him. You've always been our sister. That doesn't change. Their sincerity caught me off guard. They too had been molded by Victor's shadow. Perhaps, with time, there was still something to salvage there. My mother approached next, her face torn between guilt and relief. I should have told you long ago, she whispered. I was trying to protect you. I know, I said, meeting her gaze. And I understand now. But the most meaningful moment came later that evening, after the guests had gone and the storm had settled. Graham and I sat together in grandmother's study, surrounded by the legacy she'd left us. Not just wealth, but truth. What will you do now? He asked, his voice low, weighted with the ache of missed years. I looked around the room, the walls lined with stories and strength. I'll build something new, I said simply. Something worthy of the name they tried to take from me, and stronger than anything they ever imagined. We couldn't reclaim the years that had been quietly stolen by secrecy and silence. But as Graham smiled, a smile so unmistakably familiar it mirrored my own, I knew we could build something far better from the truth. I'd like that very much, he said. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the echoes of a fractured legacy, I felt the presence of Grandmother Margot like a steady heartbeat in the room. Her wisdom had guided every turn, her foresight orchestrating a justice so graceful it required no vengeance from me at all. She had known all along that truth, once unearthed, would speak louder than any accusation. In the end, Victor's unraveling wasn't my doing. It was his own cruelty, his own desperate obsession with bloodline purity, that exposed him for the imposter he truly was. For years, he had made me feel like a stranger at the Blackwell table, never realizing that he was the one who didn't belong. The irony struck like a final elegant chord, sharp, poetic, and utterly complete. And now, as I stepped into a future shaped not by lies but by legacy, I saw clearly that my true inheritance wasn't the fortune, the estate, or the name. It was belonging. It was truth. It was the quiet joy of finding at last a father who wanted me, and the strength to leave behind everything and everyone who never truly did.